Kiswahili is one of the most widely spoken languages on the African continent today, and its prominence is growing. According to the United Nations, it is among the 10 most widely spoken languages in the world, with more than 200 million speakers. Ushawishi wa lugha ya Kiswahili umeongezeka maradufu, na sasa hivi ni mojawapo ya lugha rasmi inayozungumzwa katika Jumuiya ya Umoja wa Afrika. Na Umoja wa Mataifa sasa umetenga Julai tarehe 7 kama siku rasmi ya kuenzi lugha hii, ikiwa ni lugha ya kwanza ya Kiafrika kupewa fursa hii ya kipekee. This week on the program, we trace the origins of Kiswahili, examine its importance to the culture and identity of the African people, and where its future lies in this digital era. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. The Kiswahili language originated along the East African coast, and the earliest known documents in Kiswahili are letters written in Tanzania in 1711. Before we begin our discussion, let's look back at the history of the language and why more people are learning it today.
Esther Mwika from Zimbabwe is joined by other students from around the world who are attending a Kiswahili class at Kenya's Daystar University. Mwika, whose desires to be a Kiswahili broadcaster, is hopeful that learning the language, which is now embraced in different countries across the world, will open up many doors beyond her target boundaries.
Record player.
Ajua kwanza ukikuwa na ile motisha ya kujifunza kitu lazima ukipende. Mwanzo nakipenda lugha ya Kiswahili. Na pia kitu ambacho kimenipa motisha au motivation ni kuona watu wa kutoka mbalimbali kuja humu nchini Kenya ili waweze kujifunza lugha ya Kiswahili.
Next to her class, it's another Kiswahili class session that comprises of Europeans, Americans, and other nationals across Africa. Kiswahili is now being embraced in several countries, and according to UNESCO, the UN's cultural organization, the language encompasses more than a dozen main dialects with around 200 million speakers across the world. The history of the language goes way back.
Ukiangalia asilia ya Kiswahili wanasema ni Kibantu. Sana sana wanarejelea maeneo ya Shungwaya, wale wa Pokomo pale, na kuja kusambaa kote. Wengi wakizungumzia ujio wa Waarabu, wakaoa Waafrika, na ikawa lugha ya kuunganisha. Na wengine wanasema hata kabla ya kuja Waarabu walikuwa wanazungumza Kiswahili. Ndio unaona visiwa vya Uswahilini wanasema Swahili. Yaani ni visiwa vya huku Afrika Mashariki. Kwa hiyo naweza nikasema ni ukanda wa pwani ya Afrika Mashariki. Angalia juhudi ambazo Waganda wameanza kukuza lugha ya Kiswahili. Sasa hivi wanabadilisha mtaala wao, silabasi yao. Kiswahili wana lugha lazima kule. Angalia Rwanda, juhudi ambazo anafanya Paul Kagame kukuza lugha ya Kiswahili.
Wanafunzi hawa wanataka kuelewa utamaduni, wanataka kuelewa biolojia, wanataka kuelewa magonjwa ya huku. Lazima wafahamu lugha inayozungumzwa na wenyeji, na ndio sababu wanakuja huku kusomea masuala ambayo pamoja na lugha wataelewa mada mbalimbali za kijamii. Lugha ya Kiswahili ndiyo kama bendera ya lugha za Kiafrika ama jamii ya Kiafrika. Sasa lugha ya Kiswahili ni lugha ya Kibantu, na lugha za Kibantu duniani ni kama 500. Lakini kwa sababu Waarabu walikuja huku, utakuta kwamba na wao waliathiri jinsi ambavyo tuliangalia mambo ya Kiswahili, kwa sababu msamiati mwingi ulitokana na Kiarabu. Kuandika kulianza na Kiarabu, na kwa sababu hiyo watu wakafikiri kwamba ni Waarabu walileta. Hapana.
Kwa msingi wa hiari,
the use of the language has become increasingly popular in many governmental circles, including the Kenyan Parliament, where most debates are conducted in Swahili to ensure utmost understanding of the lawmaking process by the common people.
Ulimwengu mzima pia umeshagundua kwamba kuna haja ya kujifunza Kiswahili. Na ndio maana basi wanafunzi wetu kama hawa wamejua kwamba kuna nyenzo nyinginezo ambazo wakizipenya vizuri Kiswahili kitawafaa kule nje, si hapa Kenya peke yake. Na ndio maana basi ni fahari yangu kuwa na wao katika vipindi vyetu vya darasani. Tunapowafundisha wanajua kwamba Kiswahili sasa si Kiswahili cha kujifunzia hapa Kenya, lakini cha kukupa fursa ya kwenda hadi nchi za nje.
Kiswahili is one of the official languages of the African Union, East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community. Nick Mudimba, CGTN.
Well, joining me now to discuss the importance of the Kiswahili language from Eldoret in Kenya, Professor Mosol Kendegor, Professor of Kiswahili at the Moi University. In Nairobi, Judy Ogana, National Program Culture Officer with UNESCO. And with me in studio, Dr. Ngala Chome, historian and commentator on politics and culture. Thank you all for joining me on the program and welcome to Talk Africa. Judy, let me start off with you here. July 7th is World Kiswahili Day, a very significant day there for the indigenous language. Can you tell us more about the significance and the origin of the day?
Of course, for us as UNESCO, we're very proud that during the General Conference in November 2021, it was passed or adopted that we recognize the role of Kiswahili language and how it plays. And so that was when the 7th of July was then recognized as the World Kiswahili Language Day. The idea, of course, is to see how we can use the language as a way of promoting cultural diversity. And of course, we know that, especially within the context of Eastern Africa, Kiswahili has become lingua franca. And so beginning to recognize it as a language that the way that we have as UNESCO or as a UN agency, it really does bring to fore the importance of the language. We also look at it as a way of fostering dialogue and actually celebrating this important language and also the culture that comes with the language. So I think that we can say that the significance of it really has been explored. Of course, understanding that we have only celebrated one, the first one in 2022, and we're celebrating this year's one in a bigger way.
Dr. Choma, you know, when you walked in, you asked if this program was going to be conducted in Swahili. Yes. Walk us through how and when the language was developed. You know, tell us about the historical significance of Swahili. Yeah.
Well, I think that Swahili, the consensus amongst historians and archaeologists as well is that Swahili and Swahili culture in general could be traced back around the 10th century. On the East African coast, particularly the sort of upper East African coast, what modern day Lamu area, Lamu Archipelago area, and then kind of spreads down the East African coast up to Mozambique and also Indian Ocean islands such as Comoros as well and Seychelles. I think what is distinctive, however, about Swahili language but also the culture is this mixing of different sort of ideological sources, and in this case in the Indian Ocean world, but also with African culture as well. It has been said that Swahili, sort of has about 60–70% loanwords from Arabic, but even that is a very recent historical phenomenon. I mean, that at least starts around the 1850s when there's increased migration from Arabia to East Africa, but also in the establishment of the Sultanate of Oman in Zanzibar during that time, an increasing influence, especially of the Busaidi a family from Oman at the time, where that's the same time where you see that there's a prestige attached to Arabic culture within Swahili, and therefore a lot of loaning of Arabic words into Swahili, which now produces the kind of language you have now. But before that, there was a lot of Bantu origins as well, building onto Swahili language. That's also part of the language as well.
But it has evolved over time.
Yes,
I mean, we see like the Swahili in Burundi or the DRC is different from the Swahili in Kenya or in Tanzania. Yes. And then there is the whole new generation that has adapted what we are now calling Sheng.
Yes.
Probably corrupting the language.
Yes.
Talk to us about this evolution.
Well, I think that's exactly the point I was trying to make, is that the distinctive nature of Swahili is this ability that the language has had across centuries of borrowing from other languages and domesticating those languages into a distinctive language that we now know as Swahili. And so therefore, whenever Swahili has traveled, it has been able to come with new ideas, new words, but also picking from pre-existing words in these regions. That's how you find these different dialects of Swahili, we call them lahajas, all the way from Lamu, its original birthplace, to everywhere that it has spread over the years, up to Central Africa, Southern Central Africa as well. There are differences of dialect, but there are also differences of accent as well. And I think maybe that's where also Sheng comes in. I think it's a bit debatable as well to consider Sheng either as a separate language of its own or as a part of Swahili as well. I think there's still a bit of debate around that within Swahili studies.
Professor Kandagor, you know, we're seeing, that Kiswahili was initially very much an oral language, you know, passed from generation to generation, but now it is even mainstreamed in the education sector. What role does education play, though, in the promotion of Swahili? Are there current initiatives or educational programs that are aimed at promoting the Swahili language, especially among the younger generation?
Now, when we come to matters education and the role it plays in development of Kiswahili, maybe just to trace a little bit, since independence, Kenya has had about, we can say about 5, different commissions, or we can call them presidential parties. They were created by different presidents. Upon independence, we were still adopting the colonial type of education.
Right.
But now we had to adopt our own. And just to mention that in all these commissions, just mentioned about the Mackay report, we had the Kamunge report in 1986. In 1999, we had the Koech report, and now we have the CBC. And all these reports, they have some, input in Kiswahili. Currently, under the CBC, we have the place of Kiswahili being mentioned clearly. And in education, what we can say is that what education has done in matters Kiswahili, the development of curriculum,
right.
The curriculum that we have now and what we had those days is quite different. So those are initiatives to ensure that, the young people, embrace Kiswahili. We have, media programs that are entailed to make sure that the young people embrace Kiswahili.
So we're going to look at the place of Kiswahili, particularly for the younger generation, where we're seeing, that the other languages such as French or English have been taking precedence in African countries. But Dr. Chome, let me come to you first with some statistics, because according to UNESCO, Swahili is now one of the most widely spoken African languages on the continent, spoken in more than 14 countries with more than 200 million speakers. What role does Kiswahili play, particularly now that we have Swahili as one of the languages spoken at the African Union, at the SADC meetings and so forth?
Yes.
What role do you see it play?
I think that, business and also in terms of conducting formal government businesses or politics has been, I would say, the sort of latest areas in which Swahili is coming to play a role, especially when it's being considered as a national or lingua franca for a country like Kenya. Then it means that Swahili has to play a role in the conduct of business, in the conduct of sort of formal government politics or policies as well. But for a majority of East Africans, or for a majority of Africans also in Central Africa, Swahili is the language of the day-to-day, is the language of sort of day-to-day expressions of love, expressions of kinship or friendship. And I think in that area in particular, Swahili is playing a very, very huge role.
Judy, can you share some of the success stories or examples of how World Kiswahili Day has positively impacted the recognition and usage of the Swahili language?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that especially since we celebrated the first one last year, there's been a lot of conversations around introducing Swahili in schools as a taught subject across the continent, and I really speak about particularly South Africa. Swahili has been introduced as a language that is being taught in schools. And the idea, I think, now is that even countries that don't have necessarily Swahili speaking are picking up the language. The other thing that I wanted to sort of point out is how Swahili is very linked to the culture. And so, for example, the way we are seeing celebrations happening this time is really experiential, experiencing Swahili, the culture and the language, and the way that I think somebody spoke about the love language, the way it is articulated, and the dynamism of the language is also being celebrated. And I think ultimately the idea is to really grow the way that the language is used across the continent, and so that it becomes really the way that we communicate and foster Pan-Africanism in the continent.
Professor Kendagor, the depth of the debate is just beginning to grow on how much we should be using Swahili on the continent. Is it important for Swahili to continue being the common language of communication in parts of Africa, or should it be replaced with those that meet international demands?
Kiswahili, absolutely, we can say that is one of those languages that should continue being used because we can see Kiswahili is becoming an international language. We really appreciate UNESCO for elevating Kiswahili to that level. We have chama cha Kiswahili, chama cha ukuzaji Kiswahili duniani. This is an international Kiswahili body that organization that is meant to make sure that Kiswahili becomes an international language. So when we talk about Kiswahili currently, being an the language of East Africa, language of Africa, it is widely used in the media, not only in Kenya, but the entire East Africa. In Africa, we have international media stations like Voice of America. We have Deutsche Welle and others that are using Kiswahili, Radio China. So Kiswahili actually has taken the international status. We talk about Kiswahili being taught in different universities in the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, and even in America.
Very interesting discussion indeed. Well, we are going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll look at how this important language could develop in the future. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Professor Musoi Kendagor, Dr. Ngala Chiome, and Judy Ogana. Before the break, we looked at the history of the Kiswahili language and its importance to the continent. Let's now take a look at the future of Kiswahili in the digital era. Dr. Chiome, do you feel, though, that Swahili should replace foreign languages in the academic or in the education and academic communication?
I wouldn't say replace. I would say maybe take a center stage and operate alongside other languages. The world is becoming increasingly connected. We're becoming a global village. A global village. I think it will be unfortunate if we constrain ourselves within one language, despite the need to develop this language as well, and to mainstream it into, like I said earlier, in our conduct of formal business, in our conduct of politics, as on the same or with parity with English and French and Germany and many other of the languages that arrived to the continent through the colonial experience. The only problem, it seems, is that the foreign languages always seem to take over or to take precedence over Swahili. Growing up in Mombasa myself and conducting my life in Swahili most of my childhood, I was made to carry what they called a disc, which is a smelly bone on my neck whenever someone had me speak Swahili, even in Mombasa. And we were encouraged to speak in English. We'd be punished to speak in Swahili. And I think that that has had a legacy. And I think that that needs to be part of this conversation, even as we celebrate World Swahili Day. We need to recognize that Swahili there's still this struggle to fully mainstream Swahili and to fully give the language the respect that it deserves.
All right. Judy, we are seeing, though, that the use and the spaces for extending Swahili is growing. And looking at the theme of this year's World Swahili Day, unleashing Kiswahili's potential in the digital era. How has technology influenced the use and growth of the language? What is the importance of digitizing the language here?
I think that, that's a pertinent question, and I think that us living in a global village and knowing how the digital space has transformed all sectors really, including education, including all sectors, Kiswahili is not far left behind. And I think that we know that because Kiswahili is very dynamic, as we said before, it's already adopting different words, and so the digital space allows for access to the language, and also to tools that can help with spreading the language, for example, in terms of learning tools, in terms of apps, in terms of even being able to share content through the digital space. I know that, for example, there's a lot of content that is being translated into Kiswahili because of the fact that the digital space allows for a lot more people to have access to this content. So the digital environment is really an opportunity to promote the language, but also to preserve it, because with the digital tools we can be able to record, and we can be able to archive and digitize different content in Kiswahili.
That question of the global village, Professor Kendagoran, you did mention how Swahili is now used by even international media here. How has globalization or modernization, though, in your view, impacted the preservation and the promotion of the Swahili language? Has it had a positive or negative impact?
I should start by saying that it has had a positive impact. Why positive impact? Because I know I mentioned about, when we talk about Kiswahili being an international language, we cannot forget the migration of people. People are migrating from Africa to the Western world. And when they go there, in the spirit of globalization, they are spreading Kiswahili in one way or the other, knowingly or unknowingly. We also talk about, when they go seek education there, some of them become teachers of Kiswahili. I know of my colleagues who have gone to abroad. You go to an history class and you become the teacher of Kiswahili because you're the only authority in Kiswahili. So we are spreading Swahili globally, and so the spirit of globalization and modernization is quite really working for Kiswahili, because Kiswahili is found in all places we are talking about. When we have international meetings, we have interpretation services being provided by Kiswahili scholars. Recently, last year, we had Chama cha Ukuzaji Kiswahili Duniani. And now, during that conference, we had Kiswahili scholars coming from all over, and exchanging ideas, cultural exchanges. We talked about shahiris, we talked about quite a number of things. And also, not forgetting translation. My colleague has already mentioned about translation. We translate quite a number of things. So actually, Kiswahili is becoming a global language.
So Swahili is becoming a global language. Do you think Swahili in the future can become a dominant language in Africa especially?
Definitely. I think the thing about Kiswahili is for a long time people have tried to associate it with a particular ethnic group, and that has always failed. Swahili has always been dynamic, and it's the reason why it was picked by a country like Kenya to be a national language, because it could not be easily identified with a particular ethnic group. The other languages that are widely spoken on the continent, such as Zulu or Tosa, those are easily identified with a particular ethnic group, and therefore that sometimes becomes an impediment towards how those languages spread across the continent. It's a challenge that Swahili doesn't seem to have, right? And which is why it's spoken in a very wide area of Africa and outside of Africa. So can Swahili become a dominant language in Africa? definitely, and it will be for that particular reason.
All right. I want to get your winding up comments. And Judy, let me start off with you. Where do you see the language in 10 or 20 years?
I think that really it's going to be a dominant language, particularly in the continent. Of course, we hope that there will be the right policies that are put in place, educational instruments or initiatives that support it, and also that with the right language policies certainly in place, educational initiatives. Really, we need to really promote the language through the education systems, but also because of the way the technological advancements are happening. I think that we really are looking at, in 20 years, as Kiswahili being an international language that is at par with French and German and other international languages. But certainly, I think that with the aim is that certainly from a continental perspective, I'm sure it will be the main language of communication and fostering cohesion among the African continent. Thank you.
All right. Professor Kendagor, where do you see the language in the next decade or two?
Currently, we're talking of Kiswahili as an East African language. For a long time, that's what we've been talking about. Now, Kiswahili is an African language. You know, being a working language in the African Union, I can say that Kiswahili in the next 10 or 20 years is going to be an international language, and we can trace it, you know, historically, we can see the way Kiswahili has really developed until you know, the recognition by UNESCO as international language to be celebrated annually. Tanzania now, they have a National Kiswahili Council. Uganda has really made quite you know, commendable steps in the development of National Kiswahili Council. For a long time, we've been talking about the National Kiswahili Council in Kenya. So once we have these councils, and we continue to push for them, because the National Kiswahili Council actually are going to help in making sure that we maintain Kiswahili at bay, you know, so that Kiswahili becomes an international language. So 20 years from now is going to be a global language.
Right, Dr. Chome, your view?
Yes, I agree actually with what has been said by Professor Kenago. I think the only way for Swahili to go in future is up and up and spreading widely and more widely. Now we have films and movies conducted in Swahili that are on Netflix. Musicians who write their music in Swahili. Has recently been accepted by the Grammys, for example. And it is through such avenues, I feel, that Swahili will continue to become a much more globalized language than it was many years ago.
All right, a very interesting discussion there indeed. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Professor Musoi Kendagor, a professor of Kiswahili at the Moi University here in Kenya, Judy Ogana, National Program Culture Officer with UNESCO, and Dr. Ngala Chome, historian and commentator on politics and culture. Thank you for being on the program. Well, remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. To keep this conversation going, and join us again next week for more at Talk Africa. Kwa niaba ya wenzangu hapa CGTN Nairobi, hadi wakati mwingine, kwaherini.